I'm going to start this story with a warning. It involves attempted suicide and the murder of kids. So if that is understandably too much for you, please don't watch this. I know some people are going to be upset with me that I cleaned one of these headstones, but when I learned of their story, it was May, which was Mental Health Awareness Month. And when I told my buddy Cindy about it, who works in that field, she said, I find it funny that sometimes people say they wish we could return to simpler times, when they don't realize how awful it sometimes was without medical advances, CPS, and the mental health treatments we have today. I like to believe that if this person had gotten the help they so obviously needed, that none of this would have happened, but that wasn't an option for them. For that reason, I still think it's an important story to share. So here goes. Mary Ward and her husband Lot were born and raised in Lincolnshire, England. In 1851, after having 2 children, Lot decided the family should move to the United States. Mary made it very clear she did not want to go, but reluctantly went. They had 3 more children for a total of 5 after they settled on the south shore of Oneida Lake in central New York. During the 5 years they had been in this country, Mary suffered terribly from depression, even attempting suicide 3 times, first by drowning, then by hanging, and lastly by taking a pocket knife to her neck. She begged her husband Lot for them to return to England, but he refused. On Sunday morning, March 23, 1856, Lot decided to go ice fishing just off the back of the house on the lake. Their oldest child was playing in the yard, and the 4 youngest were in the house with Mary. She had reached her lowest state of depression. Mary found an axe and went into the bedroom and killed her youngest child, 2-month-old William, on the bed. She then walked into the hallway and killed 3-year-old Elizabeth, who they called Anna, and 2-year-old Jeanette, who they called Nettie, who were playing on the floor. 6-year-old Emma, obviously terrified, was hiding under the bed. Mary dragged her out and hit her with the axe as well. As Mary chased after the oldest, 8-year-old Charles, across the yard, Emma was able to crawl to the doorway near her sister Anna, where she died too. There was a crust of ice on the snow in the yard, and Charles was light enough to stay above it to outrun his mother as she broke through to deep snow. He made it to their neighbor's house as Mary turned around. When the neighbor arrived, seeing the 3 girls' bodies in the doorway, Mary was standing beside the bloody axe with a razor across her neck. As he stopped her from cutting any further, he tried to ask her what she had done, and all she could do was beg for him to kill her. He got her onto the bed in hopes of calming her down and then saw the baby. The newspapers had listed her husband, Lot Ward, as dissipated, implying that he was often drunk, abusive, and had abandoned the family. But 2 weeks later, they retracted that statement when neighbors said he was actually a good provider and hadn't been drunk more than 3 times that year. At the hearing, Mary had confessed to the murders and said her only regret was not destroying all of her children and herself. Instead of a trial and being sent to prison as we would expect, Mary is sent somewhere else instead. What's almost just as unbelievable is what happens next, but I'll have to do a part 2. If you haven't watched part 1 of the story, please do that first, because it includes a warning that I'm going to talk about some pretty graphic stuff. Instead of being sent to prison for killing 4 of her 5 children with an axe, Mary Ward was instead sent to the Utica Lunatic Asylum. Treatment for mental health issues in 1856 was almost non-existent. Electroshock therapy and lobotomies weren't done until the 1930s, but what they did do involved long forced ice baths, bloodletting, and purgatives to rid the body of unwanted emotions. Today the asylum has a different name, of course, and they still do have her records, but because of patient confidentiality, they can't tell us what treatments Mary received while there, but I'm sure they were awful. However, after just 3 years, Mary was listed as cured and released back to her husband Lot, who apparently was okay with taking her back. Meanwhile, he had gotten married to another woman named Elizabeth while Mary was in the asylum. Mary continues to be listed as his wife on census records, but Elizabeth, even though she was his wife also, was listed as a domestic servant, and she and Mary were about the same age. While the 3 of them were reported to have lived quite harmoniously together, the other person living in the house with them was their only surviving child, the now 11-year-old Charles, who had witnessed his mother murder his siblings, given a statement against her in court, heard her say she regretted not killing him too, and now lived with her again. In 1869, 13 years after the murders, his father Lot was arrested and pled guilty for public intoxication. And almost 10 years later, in December of 1878, 2 boys, aged 14 and 15, were visitors to the Ward home. Lot owned a cider mill at that time and proceeded to drink 2.5 gallons of hard cider with them. The boys were understandably very drunk by the time they left Lot's house and froze to death on their walk to check their hunting traps. To make matters worse, the older brother of the 15-year-old was incredibly sick with a fever, and upon hearing of his brother's death, they worried that he would die from the shock. Lot was never charged with their deaths. So what happened to the Ward family? Well, in 1880, Lot's second wife Elizabeth passed away, but there must be a mistake on her headstone that says she was 30 when she would have been closer to 50 instead. Mary would die after considerable suffering from the effects of a cancer at age 63 in 1892, 36 years after killing her kids. Her obituary also said she was a hard-working, industrious woman and respected by all. Both of Lot's wives are buried near the 4 children, and Lot joined them in 1905, dying at age 80 from pneumonia, but he doesn't appear to have a headstone. And what happened to their son Charles, who escaped being murdered? Well, he ended up having a family in nearby Chittenango, but they have an interesting story as well that I'll share soon.